All right, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening for this talk on why anti-racism is integral to residency curricula and how we can each make it happen. My name is Kamna Balhara, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Nathan Irvin and Linda Regan. We are physician educators who have been leading a humanities and health equity focused educational program for the past 3 years at Hopkins. And we are really looking forward to sharing and dialoguing with all of you on this important topic. So our hope is that by the end of this session, you're going to be able to discuss racism and anti-racism, but more importantly, why it's so relevant to residency education, to describe some evidence-based guiding principles for how to create anti-racist curricula in residency, and reflect on your experience after participating in a brief exercise that we'll engage in towards the end as sort of a demonstration and focus on how these activities might look in action. So this is a huge topic. Of course, we cannot cover everything in 50 minutes. And we do recognize that education in residency itself is just one step or component as part of a larger movement in healthcare, and only one change that needs to be made amidst a sea of changes that need to happen. But today we're going to focus, first of all, on getting on the same page in terms of definition, getting into the what and why of anti-racism in medical education, guiding principles for creating an anti-racist residency curricula, and then some real-world examples of what this looks like in practice, concluding with an interactive activity for us to engage in.
So first things first, we'd like to start with some definitions. One key tenet engaging in these sorts of important and often challenging conversations is to ensure that we're all starting from the same page and we have the same vernacular and that we have the same mental model of what we're talking about. So we hope to orient you to a couple key concepts that we want you to be aware of. The first is race, and race is a social construct that does not have any biological basis whatsoever. Although the construct of race is dynamic and evolves with changing social, political, and historical norms, the construct perpetuates the false idea that there are static, innate characteristics that apply to sets of people despite diverse origins, life experiences, and genetic makeups. However, race is distinct from ancestry. Ancestry denotes people's shared traits based on the genetic similarities of their ancestors and accounts for the complexity of geographic variation and fluidity. While race is socially constructed, the consequences of this social construct are experienced individually and collectively by communities in the form of racism. The effects of racism can be seen in differential outcomes in health, wealth, socioeconomic status, education, opportunity, and social mobility within the United States. Racism then is not just an individual prejudice, but a hierarchical system that's based on race, created and maintained by unequal distribution of power and resources. And Dr. Cameron Jones highlights that there are 3 different types of racism we should consider. The first is institutionalized racism. This is the systematically created differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is in contrast to personally mediated racism, which is defined as prejudice and discrimination, where prejudice means differential assumptions about the abilities, the motives, and the intentions of others according to their race. And discrimination means differential actions towards others according to their race. In short, prejudice is the negative thoughts, and discrimination is the actions that those negative thoughts engender. This is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Personally mediated racism can be intentional, but also can be unintentional as well. There's also this third concept of internalized racism. And this is defined by the acceptance of members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic self-worth. It's characterized by them not believing in others who look like them, but also not believing in themselves. And it's really the sort of internalization of all this negativity that society and institutions confer upon them. So racism is a public health crisis. We've long known that racism contributes to the startling disparities as evidenced by poor maternal outcomes in Black women, differential care in outcomes of stroke and cardiovascular care for people of color, and disparities in outcomes with COVID-19, just to name a few. And it's not the aim of this presentation to give an exhaustive discussion of the evidence, but suffice it to say, they exist and racism is a root cause of them. But don't take our word for it. The CDC has declared that racism is a public health crisis and concluded that to build a healthier America for all, we must confront the systems and policies that resulted in generational injustice that has given rise to these racial and ethnic health inequities that are so apparent in the United States today. So we just talked about how racism is a threat to our patients, but it's also a threat to our learners. Systemic racism has long been present in medical education, and as a result of the Flexner Report and other unjust policies and institutional perspectives, medical students who are Black or Hispanic still remain disproportionately underrepresented when compared with the national population. These disparities persist past medical school as well. For instance, racial minorities graduating from US medical schools are less likely to find a residency position than their white counterparts, even after controlling for differences in step 1 score. Studies show that medical students and residents alike continue to face instances of discrimination or harassment throughout their training and can have significant effects on their confidence, their morale, their performance, and also their future aspirations, including their willingness to stay within medicine or particularly within sort of academic medicine as we all are doing ourselves. Keeping this unjust burden on learners of color only further helps to stifle this critical pipeline that we really need to sort of achieve health equity. Additionally, data suggests that learners' experiences with racism, both structurally and personally mediated during medical education, and an institution's engagement with anti-racist oriented activities like health equity curricula, inclusive environment, and addressing bias and creating opportunities for others, has been correlated with the likelihood that students are going to go in and work in underserved and primarily minority neighborhoods. And so this is critical if we're going to beat a lot of the health challenges that occur today. So addressing racism and creating inclusive environments is therefore critical for trainees and patients alike. Furthermore, racism is a threat to retention, inclusivity, and advancement within EM workforce itself. The AAMC data shows that while 30% of assistant professors in emergency medicine are people of color, only 17% of those at the professor level in emergency medicine are people of color, and only 0.2% of those are Black. This highlights that we have a long way to go towards creating a physician workforce that mirrors the populations being served, and that there continues to be significant barriers to promotion within our academic rates. And these things must be dismantled if we're going to achieve health equity. And that brings us to this concept of anti-racism. This is a term that in our contemporary world has become increasingly politicized or misinterpreted. It's not a new term, nor is it a new concept. For the purpose of this talk, anti-racism represents engaging in critical reflection and subsequent action on the ways in which the oppressive power relations intrinsically tied to race and embedded privileges that result from those power structures impact us and those around us. And anti-racism is an active approach to dismantling the roots of the problems which exist in power and policies that uphold structural racisms and result from conscious decisions to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. Those choices require ongoing self-reflection, self-awareness, and are something that we have to constantly force ourselves to do through life. And we don't sometimes get it right, but we have to continue in that thread. Being an anti-racist is not about who we are, it's about what we do and the conscious decisions we make day in and day out. And so it's important for us to all have some orientation to that. So with this notion in mind, it's critical that we take this paradigm and apply it to the field of medical education, since this is the business we're all in and why you all came to listen to us talk today. To make progress against the threats of racism to our patients and to emergency medicine physicians alike, it's important that we incorporate anti-racism into education. Typical training approaches such as cultural competency training, implicit bias training, or unconscious bias training are simply not enough. They don't do enough to move the needle. They're often ineffective, and they often generate ineffective and unproductive discomfort and anxiety that often leads to disengagement amongst learners because they do these activities and then they don't know what to do with them, to do with what they learn afterward. Anti-racist education goes beyond these sorts of traditional approaches and represents an intentional and strategic effort in education to address racism directly and focuses on its cognitive aspects. Anti-racist education represents a theory of learning and subsequently action that confronts prejudice by discussing what's going on now with racism, by also exploring the historical roots of racism, It means creating a climate where the historical and current reasons for continued unequal social status of different groups can be explored both at the institutional and systemic levels, but also at the personal and individual level as well. It also involves forming collaborative communities with one another, between educators and learners, and really looks to figure out how we can apply these discussions in theory and practice in order to make education better, but also our health systems and our physicians better. Now, despite its import toward work in medicine, we have a long way to go to realizing this goal in med ed. Although racism has been identified as a public health crisis, as well as a threat to the well-being and diversity of the physician workforce, anti-racist education and medical education remains extraordinarily limited. Studies note that many American medical schools have yet to even effectively integrate social determinants of health education into their curriculum consistently, let alone more challenging socio-cultural concepts like discrimination or racism. Indeed, physicians in the United States receive minimal formal training about racism during their medical careers, despite being trained in systems that further racist practices and principles seemingly without question. As evidenced by what's been written by multiple medical students, resident and faculty educators, as you can see on this slide, anti-racism in medical education represents a pressing need. Studies highlight that learners have expressed a desire for its integration in their curricula, and some are also advocating that these things be incorporated and be included as a core professional competency moving forward.
We as educators in emergency medicine are well positioned to rise, adapt, and meet this need. As we all know, emergency medicine is a window to our world, where we both witness and have the opportunity to shape the relationship between our healthcare system and our local communities. As a field, emergency medicine has evolved to fill gaps in access to care created by the forces of individual and structural racism, such as how for many years, the emergency department was the sole means for which Black patients of Black physicians could be admitted to the hospital. Unfortunately, while we're thought of as the societal and medical safety net, emergency medicine has its own history of promulgating disparities in healthcare as well as racial hostilities towards patients and healthcare workers. Even today, we must navigate a complex healthcare system that maintains significant obstacles born of racial constructs on behalf of many of our disenfranchised patients. An anti-racism curriculum can serve many purposes by allowing residents to understand the structural forces that underpin disparities in health, by preparing them to address these inequities, and helping to create inclusive learning and working environments for all. We'd like to share with you some concrete guiding principles that we've curated from the medical literature, from best practices from the non-medical literature, and on the basis of our own experiences in engaging in anti-racism education. I'd like to give you a second to take a quick picture with your phone of this QR code, and I'll drop the link to the Google Doc in the chat in a second. But the goal for the next 20 minutes or so, while Kamna is going to talk about the various guiding principles, is for you to start to think about what next 2 steps could you take right now to try to get yourself closer to any of the things that we're trying to talk about. If you think there are challenges at your own site, there's a place for you to list those. If you think there's personal needs, there's a place for you to list those as well. We have a lot of resources and references available, and we'll put this up at the end as well if you've missed it. But there's also a place if you have questions directly for us or you'd like to contact us with our emails, you can reach that there as well.
Great. So with that, let's jump into the guiding principles that we plan to cover. And they include faculty development, recognizing that not all learners are going to be on the same page, the importance of generating dialogue and a space for critical reflection, the importance of discomfort, but harnessing it in a productive way, the need for precision in these conversations, how we can challenge the paradigm and think outside the box in terms of who we partner with and the pedagogical approaches that we use in anti-racist education. Also the 3-pronged approach of looking into the past, thinking about the present, and preparing for action in the future. The importance of identifying bias, stereotypes, and racism throughout all components of GME curricula. And finally, ensuring that your anti-racist education curriculum is woven into a bigger movement of institutional change. So starting with faculty development, teaching anti-racist curricula is not just about incorporating these topics into teaching, it's literally about how we teach. So the first step really is ensuring that we as educators are ready to take this on. Anti-racist curricula require intentionality and self-reflection, and it's a lifelong learning process. In addition to becoming familiar with the historical underpinnings of racism in healthcare and medical education, preparation also involves faculty themselves reflecting on their biases, their comfort level, their motivation for engaging in these anti-racist pedagogical activities. We can't ask residents to critically reflect on these issues and be vulnerable if we're unwilling to do it ourselves. So we have to lead by example and walk the same walk that we're asking others to do. But we recognize that we're not all prepared for this and that it's stressful, especially if we don't have training. So we think it's really important that educators are offered focused training and faculty development in anti-racism. We suggest that this be done where your faculty already meet and get together, whether it's at faculty meeting or within educational program leadership meetings, where they're already dialoguing and having conversations. In such settings, it's important to start, just as we did today with Nate, with very clear definitions of what these concepts represent. It's also important to weave in discussions of racism and its structural and historical underpinnings. This also permits faculty to form communities of practice to support each other as we work together towards this goal. Amongst the things that we would want to avoid is highly important to avoid the minority tax. By providing such faculty development to all your educators, by investing in training to make all educators comfortable with the concepts of anti-racism, we make sure that the responsibility of this pedagogy doesn't land squarely only on those who identify as minoritized individuals or people of color. So in fact, a key tenet to anti-racism education underscores the fact that every single person has to do the work. For those engaging in this work, it should be rewarded or compensated in the same way as any other educational endeavor. So if someone who, for instance, is teaching ultrasound in your program is being compensated in a specific way or recognized for their academic work, those teaching anti-racism should be recognized and compensated in the same way. It needs to be integral, not a frill or something additive. It's also important to not force or expect everyone to come to the table with the same level of engagement. What we really want, the first step, is just simply getting everyone to the table and then generating an environment where people feel empowered to engage. Making assumptions or judgments about people's initial engagement or lack of engagement can only hurt the group's cohesion and collaborative practice. And beyond getting on the same page and educating ourselves on the history of racism, faculty can also receive specific training in how to have these dialogues with residents. There are multiple resources out there, a few of which are highlighted here, and all are included in our list of references. For instance, there's a courageous conversation strategy and protocol, which has very specific tenets to ensure open dialogue and maintain engagement. Delise Weir and colleagues in academic medicine in 2017 sort of offered a multi-pronged approach that involves film, ethics, community engagement to get people talking about race. Next, just as all our faculty members aren't going to be on the same page coming in, our learners also coming to the table with different needs, expectations, comfort levels. So it's important to meet your learners where they are and not assume that they're all on the same page. Previous attempts at anti-racist curricula and health professions education have shown that individuals and groups are in very different places in how they understand racism and in their willingness to accept racism as a determinant of health. This is a fantastic graphic that captures how people progress from being uncomfortable or fearing discussions around anti-racism, then progress to a zone of learning and being comfortable with discomfort, and subsequently growing around the topic of anti-racism. Our learners can fall anywhere along this spectrum, so it's important to note a one-size-fits-all approach is just not going to do the work. Studies of anti-racism curricula amongst medical students have also shown that students of color and white students have very differential needs and experiences. So for instance, students of color thought it was important to not only have time to talk about the content and skills relevant to anti-racism, but also to create space for them to debrief and address the emotional burden of racism and talking about racism. So when designing and implementing such curricula, educators should respect that polyvocality and the existence of multiple struggles and consider building in debriefs or structured check-ins with the learners. Generating dialogue and critical reflection are key components. In anti-racism, the focus is really on the process of learning itself. So the curriculum really should be generating conversation and critical reflection. Key components include emboldening residents to challenge assumptions and think critically, to start to develop an awareness of their own social positions, to have them take investment and ownership in the learning process itself, perhaps even think about enlisting your residents as design partners when you create these curricula, and engaging them to apply these theories to their clinical and personal practice in sort of an environment of collaborative learning. So moving on to discomfort. Discomfort is actually to be expected. But what's really important, what really sets your future endeavors apart, is that you make that discomfort a space of productivity. So uncomfortable moments, difficulties, crises, those are not to be avoided, nor do they indicate failure, but they're actually really important opportunities for growth. And we need to create processes and experiences to help our residents through this discomfort productively. So here's a couple ways that we can do that. I know this sounds very simple, but its importance cannot be overstated. You have to establish ground rules and expectations for your learning environment. And it may be valuable to, as a group, come up with a series of ground rules or community practices that you reiterate to your learners at the start of every session in your curriculum. And ground rules that might be helpful are encouraging people to speak authentically from their perspectives, making space for everyone to speak, but not obligating anyone to speak, active listening for those who want to hang back, addressing any issues or harms that come up in the course of these conversations and addressing them head on, normalizing struggle and discomfort, and getting learners to accept that they may not get definitive answers and closure every time we have these conversations. Another really valuable tool in creating productive conversations is the concept of the third thing. So this is really a fascinating idea. It's essentially, you think about like a work of art or an image or an essay or a film. And this kind of object or image serves as a reflective trigger or conversational mediator that generates a safe space for sharing perspectives. So in research on this concept amongst medical trainees and professionals, educators describe how directly confronting deep truth can be painful, uncomfortable, even blinding. So third things sort of offer this avenue for indirection. So a participant can move from exploring the third thing to their own story or truth. But if those revelations get too personal or too painful, they can go and pivot right back to talking about the third thing. So you're kind of modulating the tension between the depth of revelation and emotional safety. Metaphors accessed, for instance, through images allow for greater observation and understanding, and especially exploration of deeply held assumptions. And the use of art as a third thing has been shown to deepen relationships and clarify values amongst a group working together. Finally, using art or third things to talk about different or difficult topics allows us to flatten traditional hierarchies and discover a common language. A really interesting study that the AHRQ did, they had a conference on patient safety, and they used art as a third thing to allow physicians, other healthcare providers, patients, families to talk about adverse events and to talk about these events as equals without the traditional hierarchies that usually exist in relationships like this. So everyone sort of shares the common language and feels empowered to contribute. Talking about anti-racism is not going to affect everyone in the same way, and not everyone comes to the conversation on the same page. So the third thing, or the sort of third object, is a great way to set the stage. So while we're saying that discomfort and ambiguity and non-closure are components of the curriculum, it's still also important to be precise, especially when you're thinking about the definitions or ground principles that we're going to start from. So just like we did at the beginning of this conversation, it's really important to ensure we're all coming to this with a shared language. And so the group can plan on building a foundation from what's out there in the existing literature and achieve consensus on the definitions that they'll be using to give learners an opportunity to get clarity on those topics and sort of discuss what we're talking about and how we're defining it before we move forward. When developing an anti-racist curricula, we are inherently challenging existing structures or approaches that further inequities in health and healthcare. So this is actually a fantastic opportunity to think outside the box and get really creative in terms of how we're going to do this. So I think this happens in terms of partnerships and pedagogies. So it's important to bring in voices that are traditionally marginalized. So when developing an anti-racist curriculum, it may be helpful to adopt principles from the public health critical race praxis, which is a framework to approaching public health research that is cognizant of structural racism. So PHCRP, some of the core tenets are dismantling group power relations, promoting interracial dialogue, and getting us to think about our own biases. One relevant tenet to what we're talking about today is that of voice. And voice means privileging marginalized persons' contributions to the conversation so that they can illuminate any blind spots that we may have, any patterns that they may notice that are not visible to us when we're part of the social mainstream. And this could mean ensuring that the voices of those who are minoritized in your department are heard right away, right from the beginning. involving residents in curriculum development, even ensuring that patients or healthcare staff or members of your community are involved as you create these curricula. This is also a great opportunity to consider other pedagogical frameworks. So for instance, take the health humanities, which is an interdisciplinary field that pulls in the views of patients, physicians, caregivers, other members of the healthcare team, and integrates social sciences, social medicine, health policy, art, literature to go beyond the point of view of just physicians alone, and encourages interdisciplinary discourse about health in general. So adopting arts and humanities-based approaches in anti-racist curricula have been demonstrated to be feasible, um, feasible formats for this kind of conversation. Partnership with interdisciplinary colleagues, think about your undergraduate campuses or other campuses that are available where you work. Those might be great partners for coming into the conversation. You may also consider adopting structured approaches that are taken from other fields. We'll get to experience this art-based visual thinking strategies very briefly at the end of this, but it's a framework that allows for non-judgmental facilitation. And we want to think about not only venturing beyond the walls of the hospital in terms of who we partner with, but we should physically step out of the walls of the hospital. So in our program, for instance, we toured Baltimore's murals as a group across the neighborhoods around our hospital as a productive way to spark conversation on health inequity and structural racism.
The curriculum next principle for us to follow is this concept of interrogating the past, reflecting on our present, and then preparing for the future. An anti-racist curriculum must dive into the historical context and historical roots of structural racism in health. This should be tied into a reflection on current practices to understand how we, our systems, our patients are being affected in the present so that we can begin the hard work of deconstructing these harmful practices. But it's also critical to emphasize that we're not only dismantling, we're also rebuilding as well. And so talking about problems can just lead to people feeling a sense of powerlessness. And so it's important for us to be courageous and to be proactive about making the necessary changes that can help to address these issues once they're unveiled in these really important discussions. So we really need to make sure that we're being actionable and action-oriented and not just passively sort of engaging in these discussions. It's also important for us to make sure that we are doing the hard work of identifying and counteracting the biases and stereotypes and other components of our GME curricula. Now, an anti-racist curriculum shouldn't be the entire, shouldn't be the only place where we sort of address these issues. It's something that shouldn't be in a silo and something that should be sort of folded between all the other components of our medical education. We must interrogate all aspects of our curricula to ensure that our didactics, our small groups, our journal clubs are all not furthering any racist beliefs or agendas. Discussion of race or people of color should not be additive or tokenized, but integrated into other sort of formal education. And even if race is not the central subject matter, it can still be integrated into the discussion as has been done in math and engineering, where they recognize that the way things are taught or the different sort of learning strategies were sort of had racist roots in it, and they had to be open-minded to other ways of communicating and teaching these principles. Furthermore, it's important that discussions about race and disease presentation and management should be contextualized with emphasis on racism and how the social context generates these inequities, as opposed to being the fault of a particular race or inferred genetics based upon people thinking that race means sort of biology. A recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine actually is demonstrative of this point and really highlights that there are several domains in which race gets misrepresented in medical education. They basically kind of culled the curriculum for a medical school and found that there were these sort of big egregious sort of domains where these sorts of errors are happening all the time. And so in terms of the semantics of Black or Caucasian or Asian being used to infer certain things, the idea of giving a prevalence of a condition and saying, you know, Blacks are more likely to have asthma in this community, but not sort of contextualizing all the other sort of stuff around it that actually drives those disparities. And so there's all these sort of egregious things that we've been found to be occurring within sort of the medical education system. And so this study actually highlights some things that I think all medical education can do to need to think about and need to address. And they also highlighted some recommendations for things that we can do to sort of think concretely about how we can guide educators about appropriately framing these issues for their own learners. One potential tool that might be helpful is this tool checklist that was developed by some medical educators who were really interested in how we can use checklists in sort of the space of patient safety and quality, and sort of adapted that to addressing anti-racism and bias. And so looking through our own lectures, or the lectures of the students or learners that we're mentoring, and figuring out whether or not there are some biases that are being perpetuated utilizing these toolkits are one approach that we can take to further this aim as well. In addition, it's important for us to recognize that statements of anti-racism are just starting points. And it's important for us to make sure that these statements are backed with the reality that's reflective of this commitment. It takes more than just saying we're anti-racist. We have to be willing to do the hard work in order to bring these principles to fruition and earn that title. Departments must think about these principles at all levels, including faculty and leadership hiring and retention, as well as trainee recruitment, and outline transparent and measurable targets to assess their progress towards these goals and opportunities for improvement. This is a framework we would apply to any other priority within the healthcare system. And so we should apply the same sort of framework towards assessing our progress towards these anti-racist goals as well. So what does this look like in actual practice? I'm sorry. So there's lots of potential pitfalls and opportunities that you should think about. We get buy-in from you need to get buy-in from the institution, get buy-in from all the different leaders within your respective departments to sort of get change from top down, but also from the bottom up. You should pilot these sort of projects with learners to get an idea of what works, what doesn't work, so you can tailor it to something that's going to be digestible to the group that you're going to be working with. Partnering with people across the department or across the institution are really critical. These institutions are bastions of resources for people with all different types of disciplines, and so it's important for us to sort of cull those resources in order to make these things work. And just make sure that you should be trying to uplift a diversity of voices in the conversation, partnering with people in the community, as well as other institutions and other leaders who can help as well. So what does this look like in actual clinical practice? Well, there's been several different studies that have been developed, and we just want to highlight a few things that are going around the country to give you an idea of ways that you can sort of integrate these types of processes and procedures within your own organizations. Perdomo and colleagues developed an interdisciplinary longitudinal case conference curriculum called the Health Equity Rounds over at Boston Children's Hospital. And in their discussions, they encouraged learners to discuss how racism and implicit bias directly impacted patient care, and provided didactic instruction on both the historical context, as well as the sort of structural and systemic forces that shape these biases. They then reflected on ways that they can mitigate these biases and these social forces in that particular case, but then they moved back and thought about how they can incorporate all these things into their own system. And so they use these cases as jump points to go and think about how you can engage in systemic change, which I think is really effective. Another example is a program in Milwaukee, which was a multidisciplinary program of family medicine residents, faculty, pharmacists, and medical education team members who partnered with the local YWCA to complete an unlearning racism curriculum that was actually done in a virtual format. And so they took something that was adopted for the community that a couple of medical students was participating in, and brought that into the sort of GME realm with these family physicians, and it was really well received. So that's another thing you can do, is partner with local community groups in order to get these things taken care of. At Hopkins, we have an initiative entitled the Center for Health Humanities at Hopkins EM, which Carmen and I co-direct. And this year, our longitudinal curriculum has been focused on anti-racism. The health humanities is a discipline that blends the medical humanities and social emergency medicine to provide our residents and healthcare team members with the tools to understand and address the human experiences of health and illness, to see their patients as individuals within the context of a larger sort of social community and social context. And we felt that this was a natural fit for our goal of teaching anti-racism. Our curriculum was developed with input from residents, patient family advisory council members, medical educator experts, and really harnesses the humanities-based modalities, including art, narrative reflection, poetry, as well as community engagement to help our residents to mind the past, reflect on the present and all the things that we're doing right now in Baltimore with patients and within our own organization, and then figuring out how we can move forward and make things better moving forward. And so I think this proactive approach is really important for us to move forward. And we want to demonstrate one of the sort of things that we would do with our residents in the next few slides.
So I hope this is not the slide that leads to mass exodus, but we're going to have an interactive session in the few minutes that we have left. So we're going to engage in sort of a mini snapshot of what a component of a session in an anti-racism curriculum might look like. So this will be a very abbreviated version, but we hope to offer you a glimpse into how a potential session might be designed. So the guiding principles we built into this are ground rules, the third thing concept, pedagogies outside of medicine, and putting in historical context. So let's get started. Again, you won't all have to contribute. Whoever feels like can share. And so this will not be like a breakout or anything where we'll force people to turn on their videos. So do not stress. So we are going to be looking at a work of art together and talking about it. This is not about expertise in art or art history or about knowing who made this work of art or what the subject is. In fact, if you happen to know this painting or anything about it, I would really encourage you to not even consider that or mention it during the discussion, as this is not about right or wrong answers, but simply the observations, perspectives, and experiences that we all bring to the table. Everyone is invited to participate. No one is obligated to participate. Since this is an abbreviated session, we probably won't be able to get to everyone if there are multiple people, but we are excited to try to hear from all of you. This is also a learning experience for all of us, so we are all here exploring and learning together. I'm going to be using the visual thinking strategies approach, or VTS, which is a structured approach for looking at art developed by an art educator, actually the senior art educator at the MoMA, and a cognitive psychologist. And I'll have a bit of dialogue with each person who speaks before we call on the next person who'd like to participate. So we'll spend a couple minutes looking at the image, and then when we come back to discuss it, if you would like to contribute, please just raise your virtual hand and one of us will call on you. So here is the image, and we will take, let's say, just about 30 seconds to look at this image. All right, so we'll get started. What's going on in this picture? Sarah?
So I see it looks like a Black woman kneeling on a table. There's 3 white men standing around looking at her. And then there's 2 additional women kind of peeking from behind a curtain at the whole scene.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So I'm hearing you describe sort of the characters or the people portrayed, which is one Black woman kneeling on the table here, 3 men who appear to be looking at her, and then 2 people behind the curtain here. So you're mentioning that these 3 men appear to be looking at her. What do you see that makes you say that?
I mean, I think part of it's just the positioning and kind of where their gaze is. It's interesting because the way they're positioned, they have her in the middle as kind of like this almost centerpiece. It's almost weirdly reminiscent of like a banquet centerpiece with her on the table. And then gaze, the guy in the suit jacket seems to be looking directly at her. The other two men appear to be looking somewhat at her and then also almost through her at that man in the jacket.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I think Fiona has her hand up.
Yeah, it really looks like a still life, except instead of an object, there's a person there. And I think there's something, you know, the positioning of the arms sort of crossed, and there's a sense of objectification here that makes me a bit uncomfortable.
Mhm.
Okay, Fiona, so you're describing that there's something about this image that harkens back to a still life, even though these are ostensibly people. And you mentioned this sense of objectification that's uncomfortable to look at. Could you tell us what you see that makes you uncomfortable or makes you infer that there's objectification?
Yeah, it's the, you know, when somebody has their arms crossed, there's that closed sort of like, I'm not interacting with you. There's the person who's most face to face with this woman is actually doesn't appear to actually be engaging with her, and the other two white men are behind her, and you know, and again don't seem to be engaging with her. So I think that's where it feels, you know, there's actually doesn't appear to be any connection or dialogue happening between the four primary subjects here.
Thank you, Fiona. So I'm hearing you say that despite the fact that everyone's sort of angled towards each other, there appears to be this sort of disconnect that's conveyed perhaps by their body language or the way that the woman is positioned. Okay, thank you
Yes.
so much. Thank you. What more can we find?
So Meta had her hand up, and then Philip would be next.
Mostly looking at this painting made me feel so incredibly uncomfortable. She is trapped between three men in power and a sheet, and anyone who could support her is to cower behind that sheet. Two men have their sleeves rolled up as if to get to work. And in front of one man is laid out what looks like medical instruments and a bowl, presumably of water. So, you know, for her to be alone, for something to be about to happen to her, for her to have no support, and for her to be objectified as has been described as how this is depicted is really uncomfortable.
So Meta, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm hearing you point out a few things that we hadn't brought up yet, which is the sort of sleeves rolled up feels like they're about to plunge into something or do something, and you point out the possible medical instruments and a bowl of water here. That makes you feel like this person is perhaps about to undergo a procedure, that this disconnect is all the more terrifying, perhaps, that it's in the context of potentially you're implying like a patient-physician relationship, maybe. Thank you so much. What more can we find?
Phil, I think, had his hand up as well.
I was going to make the same comment about the instruments, and that with the sleeves rolled up, it certainly looks like they're about to start some kind of medical procedure or do something physical to the woman on the table. And again, as everyone has said, it's very uncomfortable to watch.
Thank you so much. Well, yeah, drawing our attention again that there is a medical procedure about to take place, and this sort of sense of discomfort. I think we have time for maybe one more comment. Is there anyone else who'd like to contribute?
Nicole?
Hi, yes, I was just going to add that it looks like the two women in the back are like also have a lot of fear in their face and sort of are questioning what's about to happen. And you can, I guess what I'm inferring is you would think they're wondering maybe is the same thing about to happen to them. And one of the other things that I immediately thought of as like we started talking about physician and patient is just sort of how there has been a lot of change in medicine, but also sort of what there is sort of a sense of that sometimes this is still like almost an image that could be done today in a sense.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So I'm hearing you draw some parallels between this image, which we are sort of all inferring is in the past, and the fact that it still looks familiar and present day. And you mentioned seeing fear and perhaps anxiety on the faces of these women. That are they going to be next? I was wondering if you could tell us more about what you see that makes you say that.
Just the sort of the peering behind the curtain as if they aren't really like supposed to be looking. Maybe they're not supposed to know what is happening behind the curtain, and just the like the hand placement from the woman in the farthest background, almost like a comfort or like trying to have some sort of sense of security with the woman in front of her as a safety of like what could be happening, and we need to stick together, I guess.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm hearing you say it's the body posture, it's how close they are together, and it's also their faces where the sort of like sideways gaze coming from behind this barrier that not only brings up, as you were mentioning, maybe a fear or anxiety about what's going to happen or is it going to happen next to them, but they're almost feeling like they're not supposed to be there or they're excluded or forbidden in some way. Did I get that right?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. I think we can make time for one more comment or close if there's anyone else who'd like to share.
Phil raised his hand again.
I get the sense that the two women in the back, there's a younger one and an older one, and it looks like the younger one is hiding behind the older one, and that's trying kind of a protective position. The older one, trying to keep the younger one away, because the woman on the table also appears young. So whatever may be happening may be planned for both of them. I don't know.
So Philip, I'm hearing you describe that there may be an age differential and that this woman may be in the role of sort of shielding this younger woman who's behind her. And so the complexity of the relationships between these women isn't 100% clear. What do you see that makes you say that one of the women is older?
It just looks like the woman in front. I'm assuming that's gray hair and not a bandana, although it might be. I just saw gray hair, and she appears to have facial features which look a little older than the one in the back.
Great. So maybe what's going on with her hair or the bandana, and then maybe the creases above the forehead that you're calling our attention to. Okay, I think I see one last hand up, and that'll be our last comment, and then we'll close.
Kira.
Hi, I'm really struck by the facial expression and body language of the woman on the table. I'm kind of torn between whether she looks really like stoic and almost numb in her facial expression, but she's also clutching her hand to her chest, which to me is either like could show grief or is showing that she might be in prayer, which both kind of either interpretation to me feels like really uncomfortable and really concerning for her.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Kira. So I'm hearing you say there's sort of a tension between her vulnerability and fear. Maybe there's strength, but hope and prayer. But either way, the fact that this person seems to be experiencing perhaps this whole gamut of emotions before a medical procedure is really concerning, because we hope we would go into the procedure, without all of these feelings. Well, I know that we're very short on time. So thank you all so much for participating and your valuable insights and willingness to share. I wish we could have heard from more of you. We usually spend 20 to 30 minutes on this, but obviously it's not feasible here. But this was the VTS method, which is a really great way to sharpen observation skills and share perspectives, reflect on our observations and how they may be influenced by our own experiences. What I always find super fascinating about these sessions is that there are things that I never noticed that I see when people are bringing up, their own observations. And so we all bring a really different, but probably very equally valuable lens when we're looking at things. And we can create a dialogue in a manner that really values the perspectives of each person, and we start to make meaning together. And there was ambiguity that everybody brought up. Like, is that an older woman? Is that a bandana? Is it her hair? What is going on with the posture of the woman on the table? Is it strength or fear? And sitting with this ambiguity and not knowing for sure really creates space for discomfort. And I was especially grateful for people, for telling us that they felt this discomfort and for sitting with that discomfort and looking at this image. So starting with a work of art or other reflective mediator is a great way to get your learners geared up for a session. This is a painting of J. Marion Sims, the often called the father of modern gynecology. The three women are Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. He perfected the repair of the vesiculovaginal fistula by operating on women who were slaves and did not use anesthesia. Unclear if he didn't have awareness that anesthesia was available or if this was based on his own beliefs about pain. But either way, raises a lot of questions about consent, as well as differential assumptions about pain. So something like this, just to show you concretely, like if you start with this image, there's so many directions you could go in, but you could discuss historical views on pain from Sims and other men such as Benjamin Rush, and traditionally racist stereotypes about pain tolerance, transition into the present and how we undertreat pain in the ED based on people's skin color, and preparing for the future by thinking about, okay, well, how do we change our pain management protocols, or what biases do we bring to the table? Or if you wanted to use this and talk about research and how in the past, progress in medicine has been made without consent when it comes to women like Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, or Henrietta Lacks, and transition to talking about current research where persistent underrepresentation of minoritized groups in clinical trials exists, and preparing for the future. What can our residents and researchers do? Community outreach, research along the public health critical race praxis, reflecting on how we even consent patients, not just for studies, but even just for procedures and what biases or assumptions might go into those conversations. So really a very rich vein of discussion just from an image. And we got a group of people that may not all know each other to sort of have a conversation about a pretty uncomfortable image. So it can be a potentially very powerful approach. And so we'll just put this back up for people. We'd love to hear from you if you'd like to share in the document and maybe see what others are facing in terms of barriers or steps they want to take. And also every single reference we talked about and some additional resources are also available at the bottom of the document. And we just like to close by saying that as educators, we have the power to transform consciousness. Transforming structures is, of course, incredibly important to transforming a healthcare system that is broken, to transforming a process of education that has its flaws. But we also need to transform consciousness. And I think it's a privilege that we get to train people who are going to be leaders in this field and set this culture for generations to come. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. We would be happy to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out to us. And we'll stick around for a minute or so if people have any questions. So thank you all.